Henry VIII is known for his brutality and evil actions towards many people who lived inside of his country, and it cannot be disputed what a tyrant he really was. However, did you know that he even changed the rules of his kingdom to allow people to be boiled alive for their role in poisoning people? The Tudor king greatly feared being poisoned to the point where he even employed a taste tester for his meals, and these unfortunate souls, although would receive some of the best food in the country, they had to contend with the thought that every mouthful they took could be their last. However, the king introduced the punishment of boiling alive for a number of reasons. Firstly, to deter anyone from poisoning their master, as it was considered a fate worse than even hanging, drawing and quartering. But the first boiling alive may have also been symbolic of the job that the victim of the boiling pot did. But was Henry VIII really behind this scheme to poison one of England's most famous bishops, and did he use the boiling alive execution method as a sick way to cover up his own schemes? In this video, we will look at the two different times that boiling alive was used in England during the reign of the infamous Tudor king. One case, as mentioned, features a cook who poisoned a bishop, but the other case features a woman who was boiled in the very same place as the first man a decade later. These are the boiling alive executions of King Henry VIII.
Henry VIII was a rather paranoid king who constantly believed that people were out to get him and kill him. It's alleged that every night he had the entrance to his bedchamber bricked up to prevent any would-be assassins taking his life, but the Tudor king had reasons to be worried. Many of the changes he made to the country with regards to religion offended many people in his realm and made them hate him and his advisors such as Thomas Cromwell. They became figures of vitriol, and uprisings such as the Pilgrimage of Grace rose up and took place opposing the dissolution of the monasteries. Many people also disliked Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, and there was even one attempt to seize her by many women who saw her as a homewrecker. But there was one horrific incident that took place inside of Henry VIII's England that saw two people killed through a poisoning plot, which went wrong. Richard Roose is remembered for being the man who was boiled alive by Henry VIII as he attempted to poison Bishop John Fisher. But what is the true story of this? Now, Richard Roose was also known as Richard Cook, and at the time he was working inside of the kitchens of Bishop John Fisher. Fisher was a leading churchman of the Tudor times, and he was in direct opposition to the king's changes with religion, which included breaking from Rome in order to secure a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Fisher wrote to Catherine mentioning how he was in opposition to the policies, but Henry saw it as necessary to declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England and turn his back on the Pope and Rome. Fisher was very vocal against this, and he could be interpreted as the enemy of the king, and with this he also could have been incurred with the wrath of Anne Boleyn. It was noted that Fisher was growing unpopular with Henry VIII, and the king even threatened to throw the bishop and his followers into the River Thames if they continued to be obstinate against his ideas. With this, it's believed Fisher may have been targeted by the king and been a subject of intimidation to get him to conform to the new ideas. Fisher was advised not to attend Parliament, where it was expected he would speak against the king and Anne Boleyn, and Anne stated, in case Fisher caught some disease as he had before, and this could have been seen as a threat, it's likely that force could have been used to try to get Fisher to conform to Henry's ideas, and with this it's possible that a poisoning plot could be linked to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Poisonings were very rare in England, especially a high-profile one, but early in the afternoon on the 18th of February 1531, Bishop Fisher and a number of guests were eating together at his place in Lambeth Marsh. It was said later that on the 18th day of February 1531, one of Richard Roose's, or Rochester Cook, also called Richard Cook, did cast poison into a vessel full of yeast or baum, standing in the kitchen of the Bishop of Rochester's palace at Lambeth Marsh, by means of which two persons who happened to eat at the pottage made with such yeast died. Whilst eating, two of the members of Fisher's household had been eating porridge, and they became mortally infected with poison which killed them. One of them was a gentleman named Bennet Curran, and the other was a woman who came to eat at the palace as she was starving, and she was called Alice Trippitt. They had both eaten the porridge and had died, and many more were very ill, including 17 who were violently affected by the meal. But Bishop Fisher did not eat, as he was fasting at the time. Many of the diners were members of the poor who were seeking charity, and with this Richard Fisher, the bishop's brother, ordered the immediate apprehension and arrest of the cook Richard Roose. But Roose had already absconded and he was running away, but he was then captured and was taken to the Tower of London for interrogation. But the effect of the poisoning was shocking, and many across the capital, especially the higher members of society and royalty, began to fear that everything they ate might be poisoned, and they feared their meal might be the last. It was not known in the March of 1531 who had given Richard Roose the poison, but it was unlikely that he had sourced it himself to spite the bishop, as he had been working there for some time. But many believed that Roose was a pawn in a bigger game, and that he had been tricked into putting it into Fisher's meal. But Richard Roose was then tortured on the rack on the brutal torture device at the Tower of London, and he then admitted to putting a laxative inside of the porridge, and it was described as a certain venom or poison, and he claimed he did this as a mere joke. But despite being tortured, he gave over no information as to where he got the poison from, and he claimed it was a white powder that would cause discomfort and slight illness, but he claimed he would have never intended to kill someone. But there were many more accusations that claimed that Roose was persuaded to do the poisoning by someone else. As if it was just a prank, then why would Bishop Fisher, a man who was immensely pious and kept a close-knit household, a target of this by his own members of staff? And there was also allegations that another man may have poisoned the porridge, or that someone in the buttery may have done this whilst Roose was out of the room. Allegedly, Henry VIII, when he heard of the poisoning, was very disturbed, and he immediately became fearful that he would have been suspected of playing Roose to kill his enemy Fisher. Henry dramatised the crime to try and take attention from his changes, and Henry may have also been reacting to the rumour, as he believed he may have been responsible. Henry was trying to bring the bishops into his control, but the poisoning of Fisher he feared may have brought in more enemies for him. Eustace Chapuis later wrote, "The king has done well to show dissatisfaction at this. He cannot wholly avoid some suspicion, if not against himself, whom I think too good to do such a thing, at least against the lady and her father. It was believed that poisoning was a crime, perfectly suited to a courtier meaning to gain favour, or a woman who wanted to earn favour in the king's eye." But what happened next was the most brutal execution of Henry VIII's reign. Henry changed the treason laws and brought an act of attainder against Richard Roose, meaning he was sentenced to death and found guilty without any trial at all. He changed the law to say that anyone who poisons someone shall be sentenced to death as high treason and shall be boiled to death in front of a large crowd. The boiling part of the execution was symbolic retribution to show Henry VIII's power, and at Smithfield, Roose was boiled to death on the 15th of April 1532. In front of a huge crowd he was tied up in chains and was then gibbeted and was lowered in and out of the boiling water 3 times until he was dead. It was an execution method which was long in its history, but it was believed Henry VIII ordered him to be boiled to mock his career as a cook, and that Roose being introduced to the boiling mixture was the poison he poured into the porridge. Onlookers were disgusted by what they saw, and they were shocked, with many being sick. It was said that he roared mighty loud, and the divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead, and other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work. But strangely, after the poisonings, it was said that volleys of gunfire from the cannon were shot through the roof of John Fisher's house, which damaged a number of the rafters. It was believed that the shot came from the Earl of Wiltshire's house across the River Thames, but it was a shocking event which had been linked to the poisoning plot. It was highly probable that the attacks were linked, and Fisher believed there was great malice intended against him. Because of this, he left for his diocese in Rochester and fled the capital. It's believed, though, that Roose's attack on the bishop was a botched attack, and at the time Fisher had been ill for a while. However, within a few years, Henry VIII would get what he ultimately wanted when Bishop John Fisher was taken to Tower Hill. The elderly bishop was found guilty of treason, and he had been made a cardinal by the Vatican in an attempt to ease the punishment he was receiving at the hands of Henry VIII. Henry ultimately declared if a cardinal's hat was sent to England for him, the Fisher would have no head to wear it on. He was charged with treason, as he was denied that the king was the supreme head of the church, and with this he was sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered. However, because of the public outrage, the sentence was commuted to beheading. Many people across London who witnessed the execution on Tower Hill drew parallels with his execution and John the Baptist, and in his final moments he went to his death with a calm courage. But his head was then stuck on a pole on London Bridge, and it was said it had a lifelike appearance which shocked the onlookers, to the point it attracted so much attention that the king ordered it to be thrown into the River Thames, and Sir Thomas More's head then replaced it.
On the 15th of April 1532, at Smithfield in London, an execution was carried out which scarred the memory of anyone who witnessed it. This execution was so sadistic and barbaric that it made women sick and turned their stomachs. The crowd saw a man dunked in and out of a boiling pot. This man was Richard Roose, who had been condemned to death by King Henry VIII for his involvement in a poisoning plot against Bishop John Fisher. Many with this have actually pointed the finger at the king and his wife Anne Boleyn, as Fisher was a key enemy of the pair, but this execution was something that the king had had to change the laws of his land to allow. But he was not the only one executed by being boiled alive by Henry VIII, and shockingly a woman also met the same fate. But what is the story of the woman boiled alive by the most notorious Tudor king of all? When Richard Roose was condemned to death, the king actually changed the laws and rules of his kingdom to allow someone who was suspected of poisoning to be executed by boiling alive. It was said by Henry VIII himself in a speech that His Highness, considering the man's life above all things, is chiefly to be favoured, and voluntary murders most highly to be detested and abhorred, and specially all kinds of murders poisoning, which in this realm hereto the Lord be thanked hath been most rate and seldom committed or practised. He then pushed through a new law allowing the sentence for poisoning to be boiling alive. This specific law claimed that the said poisoning be adjudged high treason, and that the said Richard Roose, for the said murder and poisoning of the said two persons, shall stand and be attainted of high treason, and shall be therefore boiled to death without benefit of clergy, and that in future murder by poisoning shall be adjudged high treason, and the offender, deprived of his clergy, be boiled to death. When Richard Roose's case was one which was symbolic, with him being lowered into a boiling pot representing his act of introducing poison to food, or whether Richard Roose was mocked as he was a cook, it is not known, but his execution was harrowing, and he was boiled in a broth at Smithfield inside of a cauldron, and he was lowered, in it's believed, 3 times before he was killed. It was stated by witnesses that he roared mighty loud, and divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead. And other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work. But he was not the only victim of Henry VIII to be boiled alive, and there was actually a woman who was subjected to this execution method. In the year 1542, a woman named Margaret Davy was accused of the crime of poisoning for her employer. It was claimed that to kill a man by poison is the most detestable of all, because it is most horrible and fearful to the nature of man, and of all others can be least prevented either by manhood or providence. This offence was so odious that By Act of Parliament it was made high treason, and it inflicted a more grievous and lingering death than the common law prescribed. That the offender shall be boiled to death in hot water, upon which statute Margaret Davy, a young woman, was attainted of high treason for poisoning her mistress and some others, was boiled to death in Smithfield, the 17th of March in the same year. With this, it tells us that the last documented execution by boiling alive was of this woman, Margaret Davy. She was, as mentioned, accused of poisoning a woman who employed her and others, and with this was tried. Henry VIII was himself terrified of poisoning, and he even employed a taste tester to try his food. Margaret Davy was a maidservant who was accused of poisoning 3 people in the house where she lived. She was, on the day of her execution, taken to Smithfield, the same place where Richard Roose had been executed years before, and was then boiled alive in a huge pot in front of a crowd. There were only a few accounts of this execution method being carried out, and later during the reign of Edward VI, the law was then repealed and no one was ever boiled inside of a cauldron again at Smithfields for their actions. Margaret Davy's story is one which is not the most known about, but we know that she was found guilty of poisoning 3 people, and for this she paid the ultimate price by being boiled alive in front of a crowd in London in one of the most harrowing and barbaric ways possible.